All right, good morning and welcome everyone to Senior Tech Coffee. I'm your host, Patrick Baker, and today we're going to talk about security tune-ups in a variety of different areas. Um, Senior Tech Coffee, of course, is brought to you by Prime of Life Tech. I have 30 years of technical experience in IT, and I provide education and tech support for older adults and small business owners and other folks in the senior care community. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about some different things that you can do starting like as soon as you get off this call um, to shore up the security for your computers, mobile devices, your home network. We'll also touch on Google Security Checkup, which is a feature on your Google account, and pretty much everybody has a Google account for something. And then just another brief bit about passwords, which is kind of my that's kind of my go-to, and I can never say enough about passwords, which I know sounds a little weird sometimes, but it's really important. And then we'll have time for questions. So if at any time you'd like to raise a question, feel free to either unmute yourself or you can post your question in the chat. So let's talk first off about some of the security tune-ups you can do on your computers. So the main and most important thing as far as security on your computer is your login security. Some people, their computers never leave their home and they don't have a password to get into their account on their computer. Most of the time, that's fine. The chances of someone breaking into your house and stealing your computer and then using it to do things that like steal your identity, for example, pretty small probability of that happening, but not zero, certainly. Also, if you have, important business documentation on your computer or anything that basically you wouldn't want prying eyes to be looking at, you probably ought to add a password or some sort of authentication to your user account. If you're on a Windows PC, and I think at least most of the people on this call that I'm familiar with have a PC. Windows is rolling out what they call their Windows Hello feature, which is essentially a passwordless login using either well, typically it's going to be with facial recognition. Most PCs don't come with a fingerprint reader. MacBooks do, and they allow you to log in to certain things using the fingerprint reader as well as your main login on the Mac. The facial recognition is the main biometric feature that Windows uses for login security. And so that basically means that anyone who doesn't have your face cannot access your account on your computer. And they also have all other alternatives on Windows. Besides a traditional password, you can use a PIN, just like a 4-digit or a 4-character code, like you would use for your credit card on an ATM. So anyhow, those are some options as far as login security is concerned. And I'll touch on passwords later in the program. The next big thing that you should be aware of with your computer and your security is the operating system updates. As you probably know, Windows puts out a monthly update, sometimes more frequently if there are critical security issues that are uncovered. Oftentimes, and this is an option that you can enable in your Windows update settings, you can also receive application updates along with your Windows updates. So in other words, if there were, for example, updates to Microsoft Word or Excel or something like that, that you have installed locally on your computer, you could also opt to receive those updates. But the main thing, especially with Windows, and really, for that matter, any computer, regardless of the operating system, are being aware of and installing those operating system updates on a regular basis. Last, what was it, last year, um, and really even earlier this year, there were some problems actually with Windows updates where people were basically reporting that they were either locked out of their system or there was some other problem where their system wasn't functioning normally because of problems introduced with Windows updates. I think they have got the message that they can't put out, Microsoft has, that they can't really afford to put out faulty updates that screw up people's computers anymore. Not to say that that'll never happen again, but there was enough pushback from the user community, uh, especially earlier in the year when a lot of that kind of thing was happening on a fairly regular basis, almost on a monthly basis. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. But nonetheless, I would still encourage you to install those updates. There are some settings where you can go in as far as how Windows Update works, where you can essentially specify that updates are automatically applied as soon as you receive them. Most, if not all, of the operating system updates that you get will still require a reboot when after they are installed. So Windows will probably inform you that, hey, I just installed an update. You need to reboot to finish the process. And technically, those updates don't really kick in until the operating system restarts itself. The next item on the list, anti-malware software or antivirus software. Technically, viruses are a form of malware. So malware is the broader umbrella term when you're talking about nefarious software that essentially is geared to either screw up your computer or, more often than not, to steal personally identifying information that might live on your computer so that someone could therefore steal your identity. Big deal, a huge deal. And I think everyone on the call is probably aware that the US government was recently hacked in a big way by, as it turns out, Russia. And we're still trying to uncover how deep those tentacles go in terms of their infiltration of various departments of the government. But in addition, and actually more broadly, there were like 40 companies that pretty big time companies, most of them whose business is focused around cybersecurity, in fact, that were also hacked by by Russian intelligence services. So anyhow, so having a current license for some type of anti-malware software that actively scans your computer, that's critical, especially if you're using your computer for business purposes. I myself was almost the victim of ransomware earlier this year. I had somehow picked up some type of malware, ransomware, which is technically what it's called. I don't know how I picked it up, but I happened to be running WebRoot, and WebRoot caught it, and I was able to clean my system and essentially delete all of the files on my computer that were essentially regenerating this malware. And so and ransomware is the worst of all, because essentially what it does is it encrypts the hard drive on your computer, and the premise is that unless you pay the bad actor who unleashed this stuff a ransom, they won't give you the encryption key to decrypt your hard drive. Now, if you have backups of all your data, you can bypass having to pay the ransom. But at the same time, just the fact that someone was able to insert this malware onto your computer, that in and of itself is very disconcerting. I mean, it could have come from an email attachment. It could come from visiting a website where something gets deposited on your computer without your knowledge. that contains the virus. So definitely want to have anti-malware software with a current license running on your computer. The reason, I mean, the stuff will run without a current license, but you won't get the updates. And that's the critical piece, is as new viruses and other types of malware are uncovered, we need to receive these updates from the companies like McAfee, like WebRoot, so that we're not victim to these types of attacks. In addition, let's talk about secure network connections. So this mostly applies to wireless or Wi-Fi connections. In other words, you want to, especially for somebody like Ralph, for example, who's a road warrior, and and for that matter, any of the rest of us who will hopefully someday be able to sit in a coffee shop again and go about our business and meet with people and use the Wi-Fi networks in those establishments. You want to make sure that when you attach to a Wi-Fi network, that it's a secure network connection, meaning it requires a password. If it's an open Wi-Fi network, then you should consider using a VPN. There's free VPN software that's out there, and like any free software, usually you'll have to put up with some advertising to be able to use that type of product. But there's also pretty low-cost solutions out there as well for VPN software that will not only work on your computers, but they'll also work on your mobile devices like your tablet or your smartphone.
What about, excuse me, Patrick, what
Sure.
about hotspot on your phone? I mean, I have a service through AT&T that I have, access. I can give that, say, to a client, and they
Mm-hmm.
type in the password to that, and then they can use my Wi-Fi through my
Sure.
phone. Now, sometimes it'll work and sometimes it doesn't.
So is the question, how secure is a Wi-Fi
Yeah,
hotspot?
well, it's my own Wi-Fi. That should be secure. A private hotspot,
Yeah.
right?
Um,
As opposed to the Panera open. Right.
sure.
That's it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as long as you have enabled a password
Yeah.
to be able to connect to your hotspot,
Yeah.
then yeah, then that is a secure connection.
Right. That's what I use.
Sure. Um, and then the other thing that I came across recently, which I think bears mentioning, is verifying that a public Wi-Fi network is legit. I mean, you could go to a coffee shop and there could be a Wi-Fi connection that looks like it belongs to the coffee shop, but in fact could be what is known in the hacking world as a honeypot, something that attracts, in this case, people to connect to that particular network. Only what it is, in fact, is essentially a hacker's Wi-Fi hotspot that allows them to basically start snooping around on your computer if you attach to that network. So how do you know that you're attached to a legitimate public Wi-Fi network when you're in a public setting like that? If you have any doubts about which of the Wi-Fi networks that your computer or your mobile device is showing you, you can always ask someone at the place of business, like the coffee shop or the restaurant or whatever. Hey, what's the name of your Wi-Fi network? And that way, it's completely unambiguous as to what's the correct one to attach to. And then the final item on this slide refers to the basic input-output setup, or BIOS, that is on your computer. Typically, BIOS is only something that you can access during the boot up process of your computer. Essentially, what that is the it's what's known as embedded software or firmware that is essentially burned into certain components within your computer, and it is what the computer looks for, or where the computer looks for instructions for things like, you know, where's my hard drive, where's the memory, what type of input devices do I have, um, what type of monitor am I connected to. These are all essentially instructions at a really low level on your computer, um, that require periodic updates. And it's actually a fairly involved process, at least back in the day when I used to do that on a fairly regular basis. I shouldn't say fairly regular, on a periodic basis, because the updates don't come out very frequently, but they do come out. So if you bought your computer, say for example, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, chances are there's been at least one, if not more, updates to the BIOS for that computer. How do you find out what your BIOS is and that kind of stuff? When your computer is initially booting up, there's some verbiage at the top of the screen. You'll probably see the word BIOS in there. You probably see instructions that say press such and such a key to pause, press such and such a key to enter a setup mode and that type of thing. And that's where you can actually get to the point before the computer even boots up with the operating system, where you can access the BIOS. You can basically you can access certain functions that allow you to control, like for example, which device does the computer look at first when it's booting up? Does it look at the hard drive? Will it look at, like, back in the day when computers still came equipped with CD-ROM drives or CD read-write drives or DVD drives, that type of thing? Even a USB port. You can tell it, you can essentially specify, yeah, this is the order of places where I want you to boot up. Check the USB port first, check the CD-ROM second, then go to my hard drive. Why would you want to do that? Sometimes, especially people more, usually, typically, it's fairly technical people who do this. They want to, for some reason or another, boot up their computer in a way that is not the customary way of booting it up. So, for example, there's you've probably heard of the operating system Linux, which is a newer version of an operating system from the 1970s called Unix. Okay, and there are a number of different. It's not a one company show like it is for Microsoft or Windows. I should say, Microsoft is the only company that makes Microsoft Windows, or makes Windows we're most familiar with. But there's a version of Linux called Ubuntu that people can use, and you can actually boot that up from a CD-ROM or even from a large capacity USB drive. So in other words, if you want to boot up your PC in a way that is different than the way you normally use it, that's the only reason that you would alter the boot up sequence in your BIOS. And there's other things in there too that are worth noting, most of which your average person never touches. So just something to be aware of. Let's talk next about mobile devices, unless there's other questions. Okay. So as far as mobile device security, a few similarities as we had with the computer. Make sure that your operating system updates, whether it's iOS or Android, make sure that you're applying those as you get them. Android actually issues a monthly update to their operating system. iOS a lot less frequently, but still, when those Apple updates come along, it's a good idea to get those installed, especially since they do come out fairly infrequently or less frequently than Android updates. The reason that's I emphasize that is because due to the fact that they do come out less frequently, it's a good idea to apply those updates because usually they've accumulated a lot of fixes in that amount of time. App updates. Apps can receive updates on depending on the app, a fairly frequent basis, especially the ones that get a lot of use. Things like, for example, the Facebook app or the LinkedIn app. They get a fairly frequent updates. But there's also apps or even services that your phone or your tablet uses that you don't necessarily access directly, but they have an impact on your ability to use other apps. Those types of service updates come along for the ride oftentimes, either with the operating system, more often with the operating system, but sometimes with the apps themselves. The other thing to pay attention to is the permissions that you allow your apps on your phone or your tablet. Things like location services, things like access to your webcam or your microphone. Those are things that you may want to take a look at and just make sure that you're essentially not giving the app total free reign of your device. And the reason for that is every time you give a permission for an app to do something, it's just one more way for a bad actor to access your stuff. Okay. So for example, if I'm well, like Google Maps. I mean, chances are somebody hacking Google Maps and using it to steal your identity, pretty slim chance of that. However, do you want Google to know your whereabouts like all the time, or just when you're using the app? That's where it's useful to you because it's nice to know where am I on this map so that I know where I'm, where I'm headed relative to where I am at this moment if I'm using the driving instructions or whatever directions to get to my destination. But mostly it has to do with things like essentially not giving it away to these companies that don't necessarily need the information. Oops, sorry, I just dropped something. Thanks. They don't necessarily need that information. And I am of the mind that unless it's something that is necessary for my use of a particular app, I don't allow that permission. Typically, that's going to be centered around location services for the most part, but there's other permissions that you should just be aware of that essentially you're granting those permissions to that app, usually at install time, or oftentimes the first time you actually use the app. So you have the option at that point to go in and specify the degree of permission that you give to certain apps. So just something to be aware of and to consider in terms of just keeping your devices more secure. As I mentioned previously, and this applies to mobile devices in particular, since they access network connections typically over Wi-Fi, is using those secure connections. It's recommended that you disable the auto join function for open Wi-Fi networks where your device, and it's essentially a setting where anytime you enter a physical space where there's an open Wi-Fi network, you have the option to allow your device to automatically connect to that Wi-Fi network. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, hackers or other bad actors, they can spoof an open Wi-Fi network that might look like a legitimate Wi-Fi network, but is in fact essentially one of these honeypots that I mentioned. Disabling the auto join puts the onus on you to manually select the Wi-Fi network, presumably already having done your due diligence about whether or not it's a legitimate network to attach to. Malware is a problem for mobile devices as well, same as it is for laptops and desktop computers. And when you think about it, depending on how you use your phone or your tablet, you could have a lot of personally identifying information stored on your mobile device. And if someone were to, be able to hack that in some way and steal your personally identifying information, who knows what kind of havoc they could wreak on, your bank accounts, just securing, your identity for, like opening credit cards in your name, those types of things. So having some type of malware on your mobile device is something that is pretty strongly emphasized now in the security community. And a lot of these companies these service providers that produce anti-malware software, they will oftentimes have some type of a bundle offering where, for example, WebRoot, they will, with one license, you can protect up to 5 devices with that same license. So for example, if your partner and yourself each had a computer and a smartphone, and maybe you have a tablet between you, there's 5 devices right there that you could install the anti-malware on, and you're covered. They receive pretty frequent updates. Usually that's all automatic behind the scenes. You never have to think about it. And especially with the anti-malware, that's the way I want it to work. I don't want to have to manually install, a month's worth of updates from my anti-malware provider. I want it to just do that for itself. And then the last item on this slide really applies not only just to mobile devices, but to computers as well. But I put this last bullet on here just for emphasis. Use care when you're opening email attachments or clicking on links from your mobile device. You don't really have the same ability to like hover on something like you can with a mouse, where you can actually see where where that link is taking you. And that's mostly with links, and then attachments as well. I'm just super cautious with things like attachments on an email, mainly because I want to know that it came from a trusted source. I want to know that it's not something that's going to unleash a piece of malware on my device. So, but especially on my mobile device, I don't really have the ability to examine that really closely without actually opening it. And really, that you could say the same thing with attachments on a PC for that matter. So just exercise caution with these things, especially if you're not certain who it came from in the first place.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I've had this start happening in the last month or so. Every few days, I'll get this text message. Oh, let's meet up. And then it has a link. So what I do is I go in there and I go to where it says that info thing, and I block that number. But then, there's a gazillion numbers. So then a few days later, I'll get a similar kind of message. And I guess there's nothing else is there anything else you can do, Patrick, other than just block those individual numbers that come through on a text?
Yeah, not really, unfortunately. Phishing via text messages, and there's actually they don't call it phishing when it's text messages, but I forget what the term is, but it's something equally clever. Anyhow, that has become more frequent, especially during the pandemic. Um, and yeah, really, that's your only recourse, is that if you get a message like that where, it's the person isn't identified in some way, and typically they're not. um, yeah, you just have to block those numbers. And unfortunately, because they can spoof other numbers, sometimes including your own number, that can be kind of a quandary, especially if it's a number that you might recognize, but you know for certain that it didn't come from the entity or the individual that it's claiming to come from. So, but yeah, and if you have any doubt about whether or not it's a legitimate source for that text message or that email. In other words, are you questioning whether or not that person who you might know in real life, or that company that you might have dealt with in real life, is actually sending you that? Call them and ask them, or send them an email or a text or something, or an instant message via some other source, so that you can verify that that individual, or whether that individual actually sent the thing that you received. No, those are great questions. All
I
right.
have one more question, Patrick.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I have, this is a PC, but I have an iPhone and an iPad.
Hmm.
Do I need to set up security on my apps on both the iPhone phone and the iPad separately, or do those recognize each other? You know,
They won't. So the iPhone and the iPad, even though they both use the same mobile operating system, iOS
mhm,
14, whatever, they don't actually share settings.
okay,
Um, I mean, there are things, because presumably you're using the same Apple ID on both of those devices.
right,
You are sharing certain things like contacts, um, mail accounts,
yeah,
um, those types of things, access to iCloud. Um,
mhm,
so you can access those same services by using the same Apple ID, but any individual settings that you configure on one device or the other, those are not shared. So
okay,
yeah,
thank you. Yeah,
you would have to configure those separately.
yeah, okay, thanks.
Sure. So let's talk a bit about our home networks. So first off, some folks, depending on your setup, and Ralph, yours might be unique, since you are a road warrior, and I'd be curious to know a little bit about your setup, but we'll save that for just a moment. In just a moment. Um, Oftentimes, you will have separate devices to access the internet from your house. Um, One will be the router, which is the Wi-Fi device that allows you to access your wireless network. And typically, your Wi-Fi router will also have hardwired Ethernet ports on it, usually up to 4, so that you can physically plug in a Ethernet cable to the router from your device, usually a desktop computer or a laptop. Um, and then there's the internet modem, which is the actual device that actually pipes the internet into your house. Sometimes, and often, those are the same device. So it's just one box or one device that performs both functions. The actual internet routing, or the internet access point, and then the Wi-Fi router are sometimes the same device, depending on what your service is and what equipment you may have already had on hand when you got that service. So that choice is up to you. Anyhow, both or the singular device have this embedded software that I referred to earlier called firmware. And that's essentially software that's burned into the device that makes it do what it does. And that software, um, oftentimes needs an update. I shouldn't say oftentimes, because it just depends on the device. But it's something that you can check typically within the device itself, just like you can say, for example, with Zoom, you can say check for updates, and you can see whether or not there's an updated version of that firmware. But even more fundamental than that, from a security perspective, these devices come with a default username and password for administrative access to the device. Sometimes the default password is literally the word password, or literally the word administrator. So it could be the same as the username that's used to access that device. That's something that I strongly encourage you to go in and change, like right after this call. And how do you access these devices in order to actually make these changes? Well, typically what you have to do is access the device through your web browser, and it'll be using what's known as the IP address for your router or your internet modem itself. Okay. Oftentimes, like for example, I have a client who uses CenturyLink. She received one of these combination, modem and router boxes, and it's got a label on the side that has all of that key information in one place. The IP address for the box, the username, and the password right there on the outside of the box for everyone to see. And so, that's not an issue as long as the bad actor isn't in your house. And typically the bad actor is never going to enter your house anyway. They're going to access your stuff remotely. But the point being there is that someone could pretty easily access this device using the IP address and default usernames and passwords, which are fairly common across the industry. So that's just something that I encourage you to go in and change. And that's something that you can do just typically by accessing the device itself, logging in with the default username and password, and then under the settings there somewhere, there'll be the option to change the administrator password. So between changing the default password and then updating the firmware, that gives you a pretty secure device. As far as Wi-Fi security protocols are concerned, make sure that you are using secure Wi-Fi at your house. I would not leave it open for anyone to access. So that typically the protocol that most people, or that most, I should say, most routers have by default is known as WPA. It may come with a number after it, like WPA 3 or 4, something like that. That is the most current and most secure type of encryption that Wi-Fi routers use these days. And then, of course, having a password to be able to access the Wi-Fi in your home is also, I think, necessary just to avoid any unwanted intrusion on your home network. Because if they can get on your network, your home network, there may not be a whole lot stopping them from getting to any other network attached devices on that network, even if you have a fairly secure setup. So I would make sure that you add a password to the Wi-Fi at your home. And then you can also just make sure most of the devices will use the WPA or other type of encryption or variation of that encryption by default on your router. So, but you can always go in and see what it's using and make a change if necessary by logging into that device and adjusting the settings. And typically, by the way, when you're accessing the router or the internet modem, it depends on the changes that you're making, but oftentimes, if you can do it, it's best to make those changes using a hardwired connection. That way you don't accidentally cut yourself off by changing a Wi-Fi password, for example, and then all of a sudden the connection that you have is no longer a legitimate connection because you changed the password. So, and it'll figure that out after a few minutes, and then it should shut that down. Also, only share your Wi-Fi network password with people you trust. Just don't, I wouldn't just give that away to anybody, because again, this is, essentially allowing someone to access your home network. And, 9 times out of 10, the people that you do give your Wi-Fi password to, are well-intended. They're not going to mess around with anything on your network, or any devices attached to your network. But it's just a precaution. Let's talk a bit about the Google Security Checkup. So the Google Security Checkup allows you to do a few different things. It allows you to review any signed in devices that are using that Google ID. So if you have, for example, an old computer or an old tablet or something where you were signed into Google on that device, it'll list those devices, and you can just leave everything the way it is. Or if it's something that you no longer use, but it's still technically signed into that Google account, you can just sign it out. And that way, if you end up, say donating that device to someone that you know, or donating it to an organization or someone you don't know, you're not inadvertently giving away access to your Google account along with that device. You can review recent security events. In other words, someone who attempted to access your account without your knowledge, or attempts to access that account through some other service that you initiated. That'll all be listed there. So for example, if you're using Zoom and you are connecting that to your Google Calendar, so that when you schedule a Zoom call, that thing shows up on your Google Calendar as well. That's going to show up as a security event in the Google Security Checkup. Google really wants you to set up sign-in and recovery methods. It would ideally like you to have 2 of those, one in the form of an email address that is not the same as your Google account, and then the other being typically a phone number that it can use, more to send text messages, because no one from Google is actually going to. You're not going to get a phone call from a person at Google. It's really for automated things like text messages, so that you can essentially have a way to. It's essentially like creating your own back door to your Google account. So if, for example, you signed in or you attempted to sign in too many times and screwed up the password, however many times that threshold is, Google might lock your account on whatever device that you tried and failed to log into that account with. You can use an email or a phone number, or I'm sorry, your phone itself at a specific number to recover that account in the event that you get locked out. And then, as I mentioned, you can also look at third-party access. I'm going to switch up the sharing just a little bit here, because I want to show you a couple of other things. Can you see that I changed tabs? Okay, thanks. So this is one of my test Google accounts. You access the Google Security Checkup first by going to the 9-dot menu up here, and then you pick your account. And after I do that, it takes me here to the Google account screen. And notice up here it says security issues found. Now, if there were no security issues found, see this instead. We keep your account protected. And it shows you the security checkup thing. And you got the little green checkbox here next to the blue shield. On this one here, though, on this account, it did find some security issues. So let's go in and say secure account, and let's see what it's reporting to us. So what it's telling me, among other things, is that we need to add ways to verify that it's you. So these are the these sign-in and recovery methods that I was referring to earlier. So if I click on this guy, it expands and it wants me to add a phone number and a recovery email for this particular Google account. And you don't necessarily have to add both, but there's no harm in adding both. And then essentially, as I mentioned earlier, it effectively allows you a backdoor to your account in the event that, for whatever reason, you get locked out on your computer or some other device. But in addition, as soon as my Zoom controls move out of my way, I'm going to access this other tab, which it's being fussy right now. Come on, slide out of my way. There we go. And I go back into the security checkup. There's no issues here, but I wanted to just show you these other things. So for example, third-party access. These are accounts that I have granted permission to access my Google Calendar or other parts of the Google service that I use with this particular email address. Likewise, sign-in recovery methods. I've got a phone number, a recovery email, and you can also see trusted mobile devices that I've assigned to this account, where in that case, an alert would pop up when I sign in using my Google account from some other service and says, hey, we saw that you signed into such and such using this Google ID. Was this you? Yes or no? And you can just tap the yes or no on that one. Recent security events, you can see that, Zoom was given account access on such and such a date, and so was Facebook appointments, those types of things. But also I can see, are these the devices that I'm actually using now with this account? Maybe there could be, like, for example, an old PC listed here that I no longer use. And if that were the case, I could go to the three dots and I could sign out on that device from right here, not actually even touching that physical device. So for example, if I lost my phone, I could say, "Ooh, yeah, I don't want Google to be signed in on that phone anymore because I lost it. I can't find it, and I'm not going to recover it anytime soon." You could sign out remotely from that device. So those are just some things to be aware of in terms of how this Google security checkup works. But the main thing being the recovery, the sign-in and recovery methods. I just encourage you to set those up. And once again, I'll show you how we access this. If I'm here, as long as I'm actually signed in to Google on Chrome, and you know that by the fact that your initial or your picture will show up here on the right, where I have the green circle with the T in it. You click on that 9-dot menu, which the Zoom controls are hiding from me. There we go. And I go to account. So that's how I access that stuff. Any questions? Okay. All right. Just trying to get my Google controls or my Zoom controls going here. And let's see. Let's go back to the slides. I'm going to make that big. So lastly, let's talk briefly about passwords. And as I mentioned, passwords is kind of my thing. Uh, I can't speak about this topic enough because I know from personal experience and from working with clients that passwords is not a fun thing for people. It's actually this is probably the most your biggest vulnerability for most people is your passwords. So so just briefly, make sure that you avoid sharing your passwords in an insecure manner if you have to share them at all. And when I say insecure manner, what I mean is don't email your passwords. That's the biggest culprit right there. But also, encourage you to avoid managing or storing your passwords insecurely, meaning like written on the post-it notes that surround the frame of your monitor, or maybe you have a notebook or something like that, or maybe you have a Word document or a Google Docs document or a spreadsheet that that digital document itself is not password protected. So anything that isn't um, encrypted, anything that doesn't require a master password to access your passwords is an insecure way of managing and storing your passwords. Also, I encourage you not to use the Remember Me option for websites and apps, mostly on your mobile devices or anything that you carry with you out in public, um, just because you would not want to inadvertently allow someone access to an online account that where you told the device to remember you. Now, sometimes they only remember your user ID, and that's okay. If it only remembers your user ID, but it still makes you enter a password, eh, it's okay. I mean, you're still technically giving away one of the two essential pieces of information that someone needs to access one of your online accounts. Um, it's still, so I still discourage that. Um, I also recommend that you create strong passwords. Um, and a strong password consists of all of the things I have listed here. It's 10 to 20 characters in length. It uses upper and lowercase letters, also uses numbers, and then symbols like what you get when you press the shift key and any of the numbers on your keyboard. And I also encourage you to use a password phrase for those passwords that you have to remember. So what this is supposed to say in the example here is, I like walking the dog, okay? And I used a combination of numbers, upper and lowercase letters, and symbols to create that phrase. But if you do nothing else, I encourage you to use complex passwords, create a unique password for every login that you have. In other words, don't reuse your passwords, and then use a password manager. There's free and paid versions of those. They have a lot of features that are really helpful. Some of them even have two-factor authentication built in, where they require you to use a code that's generated by either some third-party app like an authenticator app from Google or Microsoft, actually, or they have that authenticator built into the password manager itself. Anyhow, lots of options out there for password managers. And the beauty of a password manager is that you technically only have to remember one password, and that's the one you use to access your other passwords. So anyhow, so I'd like to open it up for any other questions. It looks like there might be one or two in the chat here. How does one store the password to a password manager? I got one and promptly lost the key to the app. So if that's a great question, what I recommend in the case of your master password for your password manager is that as soon as you create it, write it down. This is the only password that I will allow you. I mean, obviously you're doing your own thing, but I will allow you to write down one password on paper, and that is your master password. But that needs to then go into some sort of locked repository, whether it's a fire safe, a filing cabinet where you can physically lock the drawer, or a desk drawer or something like that. Something that's relatively secure, so that in the event that you forget your master password, um, that you have access to it somehow. Because if you do forget your master password, then you're kind of screwed for accessing your other passwords. There's really, and that's by design. The password managers are designed not to have some kind of backdoor. You need to remember that master password. The other option, and this is where you have a device like like an Apple device, um, or a PC that has some sort of, or even an Android device that has some sort of biometric capability, like either a fingerprint reader or the facial recognition. Some password managers will allow you to use these biometric authentication methods in lieu of the master password. Like, for example, I have one that it's actually quite old, the password manager software itself, but the version that I have on my let me think here for a second, on my iPad and on my MacBook allows me to use the fingerprint reader, but it'll only allow it so many times. In other words, it'll allow me to use the fingerprint reader like 10 times. And then on the 11th time, it makes me enter my master password again, just kind of as a precaution. So anyhow, great question. Let me see what other questions we've got here. What about writing a sentence and using the first letter of each word plus irregular capitalization and numbers thrown in? Um, you you know, if people have all kinds of methods for creating passwords and remembering passwords, it really comes down to what works for you. I think that the main thing, as far as I'm concerned, is try to use the combination of things that I have listed here. At least have one each of the first four things listed here as part of your password. Um, and that makes it a complex password. And then another question, recommended methods, apps for exchanging documents securely. I would say, you know, any of the cloud options that you have out there are pretty secure. You can also exchange documents. You can share documents with things like Google Drive or Dropbox. Really, any of the cloud services allow you to share a document. Um, and these services are really only as secure as your password, as far as getting access to those things. Um, the most secure option for exchanging documents securely would be to have an encrypted file on a USB drive. That thing is going to be on a physical device that typically cannot be accessed through a network unless it's plugged into a device that's also attached to a network. And if the file itself is encrypted somehow, meaning it's password protected, then you can't access that file without knowing the password.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
go ahead.
Patrick, I'm assuming that email is not a really approved method of exchanging documents securely. In
I
general.
don't think it, generally speaking, it is not a very secure way to exchange documents. Emails can be intercepted. If you choose to use email to exchange documents, you could password protect the document. It'll provide you at least some minimal layer of security to the
Okay.
file itself. But the more secure option would be to share it via the cloud, I think. Let's see. Why doesn't the fingerprint reader work more than once or twice with Apple iPhone? Is that on a, is that for like a certain program, like a password manager?
No, it's the general, you know, you can either put in your password or use the fingerprint button. And no matter how often I re-put in my fingerprint, then after a day or so, it doesn't work anymore.
Hmm.
Do I just have,
That-
you know, bad fingerprints or something?
And is that just to unlock the phone itself?
Yeah, yeah. And I assume that what you were talking about was related to that kind of thing, but I'm not sure.
Could
Yeah,
I add something?
yeah, please.
I had on my previous iPhone used the fingerprint reader, and there was a time when it just suddenly stopped working completely. And I had to put the password in. So I called Apple, and they didn't tell me what was wrong, but it was something they knew about, and they fixed it. It was some little update that needed to be done or something. I don't know what it was. My current phone uses facial recognition, so it's not happening anymore, but I don't know if that's what's going on with yours, but
Well, I don't know. I have talked with Apple about it in the past, and I kind of gave up because,
Yeah.
you know, I just put in the password.
I was just lucky.
Yeah, well, I have an older phone, so, you know, maybe it just didn't work well, or maybe there's something with my fingerprints that don't take. I mean, usually there was a problem in some of the community, you know, when I worked in companies too, wouldn't work that well.
I haven't heard of that type of intermittent thing with the unlock function. What I was referring to was the specific app that I use for password management that it'll accept the fingerprint so many times, and then after that, I don't know, I'm just picking a number here, the 10th time or whatever, it will require that I enter the password before I can continue using the fingerprint. So, and that just seems like an extra security measure. What you're talking about, though, sounds like a bug. It doesn't, that sounds like something that's not working correctly.
I should ask them again, you know.
Um,
I get fatigued with apples sometimes.
sure.
So,
Well, yeah,
you know.
it's understandable, especially when you have to wait a long time to speak with someone, and yeah, it's super
And it
frustrating.
takes forever, and some issues take months to resolve.
Yeah.
But then, you know, if I have the patience, and I often just trying to get my work done. You know.
Understood.
Anyway, thank you.
Sure.
Much.
All right.
Earlier in this presentation, Patrick, I'm so sorry I was late. I was on the phone with unemployment and I couldn't get off. You know, I'd waited so long to hear from them. Early in this presentation, did you go over the various types of security apps you recommend?
Not specifically. We talked more generally about, I mean, really the main security apps that we talked about using were anti-malware type of software, stuff like McAfee and WebRoot, that type of stuff that I encourage folks to run on all their devices, just to avoid picking up some software that can compromise your device's integrity, that's used as a tool for identity thieves, that type of thing. That's really the main specific recommendation that I had security wise. Otherwise, it's mostly best practices for using your devices, as well as maintaining updates on your devices. But I'm recording this, and there'll be a recording available later on, and you can check out everything that you missed.
Wait, do you have a specific feeling about malware bites?
Malware bites, to my knowledge, has been a really successful product for a lot of people.
I use it, Patricia. That's what I use. It was recommended by my other IT consultant who I've had before I met Patrick. Yeah, I've been very happy with that.
Yeah, it works well. It gets all the updates. I had a client recently in the last few months who had a virus on her computer, and she had a copy of Malwarebytes. It wasn't actively scanning. That was the only thing that I saw that I didn't like about it, is that it didn't appear to actively scan her system. Now, it could have been an older version.
Well, you have to schedule that, Patrick, excuse me. I mean, you have to go in there and set it up to do it at 2 a.m. every week or whatever.
Right.
And that, I think she probably helped me with that way back when.
Gotcha.
What
I'm referring to, though, is like the real-time scanning.
Yeah.
So in other words, to attachment that contained a virus, my question in my mind is my anti-malware scanning that file I'm opening? That's what I mean by active scanning. So anyhow, and if you have any other questions, feel free to email me or give me a call. I just wanted to mention that I've got a couple of future senior tech coffee sessions scheduled for January. Going to be basically expanding on the topic of communication tech in older adult care. And I'm going to be interviewing guests from a couple of different companies. Routinify is a company that makes, in addition to having an app for communication between families, caregivers, and older adults, they also essentially have a whole system that includes wearables, smart home tech, and that kind of stuff that's all integrated. And then on the 20th, I'll be interviewing a couple of folks who have worked with Open Arms Assisted Living in Montbello. It's an assisted living company or facility that opened just recently, within the last month or so.
Wow.
And they have built technology into individual rooms that integrates with the television in the room. They have smart TVs in every room, and they use that in combination with encrypted video calls between care providers and families and the individuals staying in the room, wearable devices and all that kind of stuff to basically help folks maintain awareness of an older person's well-being. Anyhow, those are coming up on the 6th and the 20th. You can register on Meetup if you'd like to attend. Of course, my contact information if you want to get a hold of me. And I appreciate you attending today.
It was very good. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick.
I appreciate it.
Can't wait to see what I missed, and it looked really rich. So thank you.
Yeah, very good.
You
Merry
bet.
Christmas,
Thank you,
everybody.
Yeah, and I'm sorry we went a little long. So
Okay.
thanks so much.
All right.
Okay, thank
And
you.
Bye.
enjoy your
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye. Bye, everyone.